Hey there, Griff Hamlin here from Blues Guitar Unleashed. Welcome. Thanks for joining me. Today's video is one that I guess I'm going to have to talk about. We're going to talk about triads. Okay, now the thing is I've gotten gobs and gobs and gobs of questions lately about these elusive triads, like they're some amazing thing. And I guess there's a lot going around the internet these days and videos, and people are talking about triads, and so everybody wants to know what they are and what they can do, and they think they should use them. And this is very similar to the cage hysteria from a few years back. I remember everybody had to learn caged, and it was just this thing everywhere. And so I want to be very clear. I'm going to show you what triads are. I'm going to show you how they work. I believe there's a little bit of, I don't want to say misuse of terminology, but maybe some confusion as far as terminology. So I'm going to clarify some of that because fundamentally triads are not complicated. They're actually very, very simple. What you can do with them musically is going to radically change depending on the type of music that you're playing. And so this is Blues Guitar Unleashed. And while I play a lot of different styles of music, primarily I focus my lessons on blues. So I want to be very clear that if you are a blues player and a fairly straight ahead traditional blues player, you probably don't care very much at all about triads and what they are and how they work. There are a handful of uses potentially for you, but it's really not part of the blues vocabulary. So getting that out of the way, a lot of you might be like, cool, I don't need to know this, and move on with your day. Great, I hope I can do that for you. They're not that exciting or interesting for many people because they're just not that useful. The fundamental thing about a triad is that it's a chord, okay? So it's a major, either a major triad or a minor triad. You can have diminished, you can have augmented, but it's a triad. It's a 3-note chord, okay? So we have like major, minor, diminished, augmented, right? So major, minor, if I make it diminished, right? Or I could make it augmented, which just sounds kind of weird, but that is what a triad is. It is a 3-note chord, okay? Done. That now you know. We have dyads, for example. Sometimes people call power chords dyads, 2 notes, as opposed to a triad. Okay? But what you probably want to know is, okay, well, how do I play them? Cool. All right, well, let's say I'm playing a C chord, right? Now, first of all, I should mention, before we get too crazy on this, there's a fundamental piece of music theory that I guess you don't necessarily have to know to use triads, but it's probably going to help 99 out of 100 times. And that fundamental piece of music theory is you need to know how to build a major scale. So starting from any root, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. If you do it all on one string, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Okay. The other fundamental piece of music theory that you need to know is what's commonly called the standard harmony rule. Meaning if you take the 1 of a major scale and you build a chord off of it, it's going to be major. Okay? Don't ask me why. I can't get into that right now. That's just the way it is. 2 and 3 will be minor. 4 and 5 will be major. 6 will be minor. 7 will be diminished. And of course, back to the root will be 1. Okay? So you're going to notice a grand total of 3 major triads, 3 minor triads, and 1 diminished triad in any given key. Now, that's a traditional classical music definition of a key. It doesn't have anything to do with blues. Again, that's going to be one of the places where blues and everybody else are going to kind of veer apart. In blues, we use a lot of dominant 7th chords. We use the word key very liberally, very, very loosely, right? So when we say we're playing a blues in G and then we play a G7 chord, right away we've broke the rules because you can't have a dominant 7th 1 chord. Or 4. 5 is the only one you get. Okay? So again, I'm just trying to throw it all out there because I'm not entirely sure exactly what it is y'all want to know about triads. So I'm just trying to throw it all out there. Fundamentally, I can play a triad in a lot of different ways, right? Any root, third, fifth, right? If I take that major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the first note, the third note, and the fifth note make a major triad. If I take the third and I lower it, I get a minor triad. So we call that root, flat third, fifth. Okay, so if this is my root, this G right here at the, this is the 5th fret of the 4th string, and I'm in the key of G, that would be a major triad. If I go up a whole step to the 2, right, and I play a triad, it should be minor, because remember that standard harmony rule says it should be minor. The 3 would be minor, the 4, major, 5 would be major, 6 would be minor, 7 would be diminished, and then I'd get back to my 8, or root. Okay, so I played that on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd string. That's one way to do it. Now, one thing that I think gets confused is triads and inversions. Okay, so let me kind of explain what I mean by that. Let's take a C. I have a C here at the 5th fret of the 3rd string. And then I have an E, and then I have a G. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 3, 5. I have a C major triad. Okay. I could play that in a different order. Right now, the C is at the bottom for a C triad. We call that root position. I could play it here. Now the 3rd, the E, and there's the G, and there's the C. I put the C on top. We call that first inversion. Or I could play it here. Okay, there's the 5th, there's the root, there's the 3rd. I could play that also down here. Take your pick. And we call that second inversion. Okay, so again, all 3 of those are triads, but they are in different inversions. This is a C major triad. This is a C major triad. This is a C major triad. This is root position. This is first inversion. This is second inversion. Okay, so I could see a use in, I'll say, rhythm guitar, where one person maybe is playing a C down here or down here, and you have a second guitar in the band, and that person wants to play a C chord somewhere else on the neck. That would be also a C chord somewhere else on the neck. Now, do I need triads to know that? No, I don't. Let's be clear, right? If that's a C and I know that's a C, right? I know my root on the 6th string bar chords. I know my bar chords with their roots on the 5th string. If you are caged inclined, right, then you know that there are a lot of different ways to play any single chord. Caged and triads, to some degree, you could say, are related because you are playing major chords, C, A, G, E, and D shapes, and there are C, A, G, E, and D major triads or minor triads, etc., etc. So to some degree, I think caged and triads sort of get coagulated a lot. It's probably not the right word, but I think you know what I'm going for. They get kind of mixed together a lot. They are not necessarily related, but kind of are, because they're kind of talking about the same thing. Okay, so again, there's I'll say one application. Now, of course, when I play a C chord, like just an open C chord like this, I'm playing, there's a C triad, and there's some more. I'm doubling some notes. Okay, so we generally call that a chord. We don't generally call it a triad. Okay, is a chord not a triad? Well, no. I mean, a triad can be a chord, but a chord doesn't have to be a triad, right? I could play that, which is a C major 7th chord, and that is a chord, but not a triad. Okay, so again, terminology is kind of important. Like, triads are chords, but chords don't have to be triads. Hope you're with me. All right, now, I could play I could use any set of strings, right? So that is also a C major triad. Just barring across the 5th string on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th strings. This happens to be second inversion. If you look at any chord shape you know, right? For example, basic, I call this basic rock and roll bar chord. Okay, there is going to be a triad in there somewhere, right? It has to be, because it's a major chord. If it's a minor chord, there has to be a triad in there somewhere. Usually there's more than one. Right, so, sorry, I got carried away. Basically, at any point, any chord that you know could be broken apart into its, triadic components, if you wish. I don't look at chords that way typically. Okay, so a lot of times if I'm playing chords, for one thing, I'm playing dominant seventh chords. Okay, but if I was playing just open position chords, like D major, right? And then I need G major, like it's right there. Okay, but I'm not using triads to play that. I know that that's a D, and I know that that's a G, and it's close. And I just used the top part of it. Okay, so again, did I use triads to do that? No, but are they triads? Yes. But like I say, there's no, I didn't use triads in some magical way. Now, I used my knowledge of chords. Okay, so for example, if you don't know, like if you only know one way to play a C chord, caged might be useful to you, because caged, for example, would show you that you could play a C chord like this, or a C chord like this, or down here, or there, or there, right? That there's fundamentally 5 shapes on your guitar to play any particular chord. I can play a G here, 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 I can play a G here. And there is some overlap, and there is some crossover between the shapes. For example, that D shape shares the top 3 notes with the C shape. So that triad doesn't change, that part of the chord doesn't change, going between the D and the C shapes. Again, am I using triads for any of this? No, I don't think that way. Okay? Now, can I use triads for soloing? Well, sort of. I mean, I guess I could play, if I was playing like something in A and I wanted to go, and I just wanted to play like little chord shapes to get that kind of a vibe. Okay, well, yeah, that's, a little bit of that chord, right? That's a little bit of that chord. That is a little bit of that chord. So again, I'm using my knowledge of chord shapes, but I'm not using triads specifically, because if I wanted to play 7th chords, like if I wanted to get something a little bit different, I would have to know the chords better. I would have to know dominant 7th chords and not just major and minor chords. So again, triads are chords, but chords are not necessarily triads. So this is one of those situations where, yes, I'm using my knowledge of chord shapes and being able to move them around, but not specifically triads. Right? I mean, it happens to be a triad if I'm in a key that makes sense. But in all likelihood, I'm not. In all likelihood, I'm going to use dominant 7th chords, which are going to get me outside of the triad world into the 4-note chord world. And that's going to require a different set of skills anyway. So you can see this is where I struggle. These triads are, again, sort of touted as this magical, mythical thing, and they're not. What you need is you need to be able to play chords all around your guitar. And there are many ways to learn that. Caged is a very popular one, okay? And I do have a course on how to do caged and how to get through those chord shapes and everything. But it's not the only way, I actually didn't learn how to play all these chords that way. I learned because I was a classical guitar student as I was younger, and so I learned arpeggios. And that's another thing that comes up a lot is people talk about using triads to solo. Okay, well, so this is, and again, I think this is a terminology thing. This, if I play an A triad, that's a chord, right? I'm playing a chord, I'm playing a triad. If I play A, C sharp, and E, I'm playing what I consider an arpeggio. Okay, so we have, playing a chord all at the same time. We call it playing a chord. Maybe it's a triad, maybe it's not. And then we have an arpeggio, which is where we take the individual notes of the chord and we play them. Okay, so some people will say, oh, I'm playing an A triad. And my response to that is, okay, well, you are playing the notes that happen to be in an A major triad, but that's an arpeggio. When you break apart a chord and play its individual notes, generally speaking, we call that an arpeggio. And again, there are many, many ways to learn and use arpeggios. I have a course called Chord by Chord Blues Soloing that gets into that very in depth. It's the whole course is all about soloing from an arpeggio and a chord tone standpoint. But again, does that use triads? No, not generally speaking. It's not that I won't play arpeggios that are triads. I will sometimes, but I'll also play arpeggios that aren't triads. So it's, again, one of those things where I wouldn't advise focusing your attention on triads. I think it's an easy way to get sort of off of your goal. And one of the ways that I know this is because I always ask people when I get a message that says, hey, I want to learn about arpeggios, which of your courses or what of your lessons about triads, what courses, what lessons do you have that talk about triad? And my answer is always the same, which is, okay, well, triads can be used in a lot of different ways. They can come up as chords, they can come up as arpeggios, they can come up as soloing ideas or chordal ideas. What's the type of music that you want to make that you think having this knowledge of triads specifically is going to facilitate that? And if you ask yourself that, okay, well, what is it that I want to do? And you might hear like a certain player and he plays a thing and you say, well, that's really cool. What were you doing? He says, well, I used a triad to do that. Okay, cool. I get that. There are things that you can do, more advanced things, for example, particularly over like an A dominant seventh chord, where I can use an F arpeggio, or dare I say triad, although I would not call it a triad because I'm not going to play all the notes at the same time. I would call it an arpeggio. But I could, over an A7 chord, I can do things like that. And I can play arpeggios that don't go with the current existing chord to get a kind of an outside sound. Is that a thing? Absolutely, it's a thing. It's a really cool thing if you're into those sorts of sounds. There's some really neat stuff you can do with that. And many jazz guitar players, Robin Ford and Larry Carlton and Pat Metheny and a lot of these guys will use tones borrowed from chords that are, I'll say, outside the key. And they'll use those in their lines to create this sort of outside, really cool, tense sound that can then be resolved later on. And they might call them triads, and they might be triads, conceptually, but the reality is that you're probably going to play them as an arpeggio. So again, I would hesitate I wouldn't call them triads for the purpose of learning. I would call them arpeggios for the purpose of learning. So it's entirely possible that you're wanting to know about triads and maybe your friends are talking about it, or maybe your guitar teacher's talking about it, or you're seeing it in sort of the global guitar community. You're seeing all about these triads and you're trying to learn about them, when really what you're probably looking for are arpeggios and chord shapes, right? The ability to play a chord, anywhere on the guitar fretboard. like being able to see all of the notes of a C, because I can see this shape, and 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 I can see this shape. And so I kind of put them all together. And when I'm done, it seems like I know all of these notes all over the fretboard, but really what I'm doing is I'm playing this little shape, and then this little shape, and then this little shape, and I'm just connecting them all together. And again, something like caged is a common and popular way to do that. It's not how I learned, but it's a good way to teach. It's a good vehicle for teaching that concept. So hopefully, if you're one of the people that have reached out to me, I've been able to maybe answer some of those questions. If you happen to be one of my All Access Pass holders and you have access to everything that I own or that I've ever made, the Caged Unleashed or the Chord by Chord blues soloing are probably where you want to go if this is the kind of thing that you want to do. Those are very in-depth into chord shapes and arpeggios and all of the things that could be considered triads but don't necessarily have to be considered triads. So again, it's important to understand that a triad is sort of a limited scope. It's a, 3-note chord cluster and no more. And a lot of times we might use a 3-note cluster of notes, but a lot of times we're going to use 4 notes or 5 notes or 6 notes. And so that triad you can run out of steam with it rather quickly, at least in my experience. And this is my experience in blues and jazz, probably more so than pop music or classical music, where the chords tend to be a little bit more middle of the road. And yeah, you're probably going to get a lot more mileage in a pop environment or a traditional rock environment than you will from a jazz or a blues environment, unless, again, you're trying to do things that are maybe a little bit outside where you want to borrow some notes that wouldn't otherwise be in that key. Okay, so I know this is a little heady. I know it's a little theory, some stuff going on, but this is just, like I said, something that I've heard so much about. Many, many, many questions lately. So I'm hoping this will kind of answer those questions and put things into perspective. Be aware, above all else, that I think the terminology that gets thrown around may or may not always be entirely accurate. And what you're probably looking for are ways to play chords and ways to play arpeggios, and not necessarily triads, although triads will be included in those things. So that's it for today. I'll share that with you. Of course, if you have guitar playing friends that you think will get something out of my video, I hope you'll share it with them. As always, if you're one of my students and you have like the All Access Pass, or you have the Caged Unleashed or the Chord by Chord blues soloing, that is probably where you're going to want to go for this stuff. But again, you can always write me a message on the forum. I'm always happy to answer it. We have discussions about this kind of thing all the time. So no big deal. I'm happy to talk more about it as we go. And if you have questions, leave them under this video. I can always address them in another video if there's something that I missed. Again, this is something that's hard for me to cover because it's not something, I don't think this way. And I'm not sure that it's always the most appropriate way to think. So I know what triads are, I know how to use them, I know what to do with them, but I don't do anything with them, and so therefore I'm not entirely sure. I've watched a lot of videos where other people use them, and I see how they do it. It's just, I wouldn't call that a triad. I would call it an arpeggio, or I would call it, using chord shapes or something different. So hopefully this is helpful, and I'll sign off here. And again, I'm Griff Hamlin from Blues Guitar Unleashed, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.